Hello, good afternoon, and welcome back to the Title Sports Network podcast with myself, Seb Parkinson, and the man himself, Dan Rafael. Dan, I've been away for the weekend. I was at a wedding, so my boxing has been pretty switched off. It's been pretty chaotic. So I need you to educate me on what's happened as much over the weekend as much as the listeners. So, but for everybody that saw the show last week, we had another really successful show. We decided today that we're going to do the show live because we're going to do a live Q&A. So anybody that is watching on YouTube, if you do want to leave a comment, it will come up in the feed on my page so I can bring them up on screen. But we have got some from last week's show. But before we get into that, Dan, let's do everything in order. So we had one big show over the weekend over in Canada, and it was a win for Christian Mbilli. How did that go, and what were the main takeaways of that?
Well, you did pick, I guess, a pretty good weekend to head off to a wedding because, like you said, it was just the one show. Neither one of them were world title fights, not a huge card, but two fights that on paper said were interesting going in, and for different reasons, they both turned out to be that way in actual practice. So it was definitely worth watching. But the upshot in the main event was you got Christian Mbilli, the undefeated, rising super middleweight contender, who's been knocking guys out, looking good, drawing a crowd, always in great condition, and has been really yearning to get a bigger test against a better opponent, even though he's already achieved the #1 ranking in the WBC and is hoping to get some kind of title shot. Obviously Canelo Alvarez holds the belts, and it's hard to land those shots, but he was hoping to at least make some kind of statement, I guess, in terms of getting a victory. And he's matched up with what I thought, and I don't think I was alone in the assessment, the toughest opponent and the toughest fight of his career so far in Sergey Derevyanchenko, who, if anybody follows him or watches him, knows, A, he's an absolute warrior, and B, even when he's lost, he's always given the very best fighters a very hard fight. This is a man who had lost in 3 middleweight world title fights, but had given great competition to the guys he faced. I thought he defeated Gennady Golovkin on the night that they had their fight a few years ago. He also had a split decision loss for a title against Daniel Jacobs. He had another fight that was probably a little more clear cut in terms of losing, but still competitive against Jermall Charlo. And then you look at some other fights that this guy had that weren't even for titles, but he lost a majority decision in a 10-rounder to Carlos Adames, who went on to become the WBC title holder. And he had, obviously, if the best fight of his career that people know, other than the Golovkin fight, was just last year. He engaged in what a lot of people picked as the 2023 fight of the year, a very close loss in a terrific fight against Jaime Munguia. So he's battle tested and kind of a hard luck loser, if you will. I mean, on a given night, a certain, judge goes one way or the other. He easily could have held a middleweight title. Was an Olympian for Ukraine in 2008. Anyway, really good fighter and a strong test, great chin, never been stopped before, and, decent power. And, everybody thought they're going to give him a good fight. He's going to give him a good fight. It's going to be competitive. And while it was a good fight, it turned out to be awfully one-sided, and Mbilli basically gave him a beatdown. Part of the problem in terms of if you're Derevyanchenko is that early in the fight he suffered a torn biceps in his arm, and it left him in his right arm. It left him basically with I forget if it was his right or his left, but it left him as a one-armed fighter for the whole fight. And you're already in a rough spot having to fight Christian Mbilli in the first place. Now you're down to one arm, and on top of that, you've been in a lot of wars. You're 38 years old. And, you've got a good chin, but you take shots, but you took a lot of heavy punches. And if you get later in that fight, Seb, 7th round, 8th round, 9th round, at least to me anyway, it's like, why is this still going on? They had a lot of conversation about stopping it in the corner. The referee seemed somewhat oblivious to what was happening in terms of the punishment that he was taking. And they just let him go the distance. I mean, he did survive. And, I guess if you can have a moral victory, I guess you can, but took a lot of excessive punishment those last few rounds for really no apparent reason. Nonetheless, Derevyanchenko lost. This was the most clear-cut loss of that career that I just mentioned, of the close losses. And for Mbilli, look, he gets the win he needed. He gets a dominating victory against a good opponent who did give him a little bit of a test at times. And then he makes a declaration, I want my title shot. And he did ask for Canelo. He's not going to get him right away for obvious reasons. He's got a fight coming up next month, and we'll see what happens after that. Now, one thing to take into account is that Jaime Munguia is going to be with Top Rank now, and in his next fight that comes up in late September, he's going to take on a fighter named Eric Bazinian. And I know when Top Rank did the deal and they were now co-promoting Mbilli, this was their second fight working with him on a co-promotion. What they're hoping to do is to make and this would be a terrific fight, by the way, is Mbilli against Jaime Munguia. I mean, that's like a can't miss kind of fight. So we'll see if they can get that done. If Munguia's got to, do his job coming up in a September fight. But that was the upshot there in that main event. You've got the continuing rise of Mbilli, strong as a bull, ready to fight for some kind of title, big fight. And you got Derevyanchenko, massive warrior, all respect, tip of the hat to him. We'll see what he does in the future, but it was a rough loss because just the punishment. And you feel bad for him also just because you just don't know how things would have turned out if he doesn't blow the arm. I suspect he still loses the fight, but it probably wouldn't have been the kind of one-sided scoring that we saw.
Yeah, just for anybody that missed it, the judges scored it 100-90, so complete shutout. 98-92, 99-91. So Pascal,
it was by the way, he did damage his left. It was the left arm that went, so he was limited to strictly the right hand for the remainder of the fight. What
do you think then that what the judge that scored it 98-92 saw from Derevyanchenko to not give it a completely one-sided affair?
Well, are you saying it was that one judge gave him 2 rounds? That's a hard. You're right. I mean, I scored the fight 99-91. So I gave Derevyanchenko, to my recollection, I actually gave him the 4th round, which was the round where it seemed like the injury happened. ESPN's cameras on a replay showed what seemed like the exact moment where you saw the bicep rip and it sort of started to roll up into his arm. I've seen that injury before. I'll give you a story real quick. Years and years ago, I covered a fight in New Orleans, Louisiana, when Roy Jones was then the light heavyweight champion, and he fought the top contender, Eric Harding. And Eric Harding gave Roy Jones a really hard fight that night, one of Roy's toughest fights during his absolute prime. And but he tore his bicep in the fight. And I can still recall leaving the next morning very, very early to go to the airport with a writer colleague friend of mine. We were traveling. We were going to go to the airport together. And we saw Eric Harding and his team pull up to the airport. They had been at the hospital ever since the fight had ended. And we had known Eric a little bit. And he came out of the car, and said hello to us. And we chatted with him for a minute. He's just like getting back from the hospital after a rough night. We're waking up and going to the airport. And he showed us the bicep in the arm. He had a sling on, but you could see it rolled up, into the arm. And it was kind of nasty. And that's basically the same look that I saw when you saw the arm tear in Sergey Derevyanchenko. So that's a rough injury to overcome. And at his age, you're wondering, how long of a layoff is that going to be? Is there going to be a need or desire to come back after that? He's made great money. No one's going to cry for Sergey Derevyanchenko. He's probably the greatest paid 15-6 fighter in the history of boxing. He's probably grossed close to $10 million or more dollars because of all those notable fights I've mentioned to you. So he's not going to be wanting for financial stability, But in terms of Mbilli, we'll see what happens with him. But he's in line for something big.
Yeah, potentially. You were saying about them not stopping the fight. Is the potential that he's never been stopped in his career, and if it is going to be his last fight, he wants to go out on his sword?
I get that mentality, but that shouldn't be the concern of the referee or the trainer. I mean, you're there to protect the fighter, period. Whatever, I don't believe in moral victories in boxing if you're getting your ass kicked. I mean, but you mentioned about the judges. Sergey, I was going to say in that 4th round where he had the arm injury happen, that's actually, he finished that round pretty well. That's the round I actually gave to him. So, he did win that round. You could maybe have given him, in boxing, sometimes you have like an opening round where like nothing happens and it's, one punch here, one punch there. So it's the kind of thing that could go either way. I didn't get a chance to see the official scorecards, but I suspect that the judge gave him 2 rounds, probably gave him 2 of those first 4 or 5 rounds. And then after that, it was like just a complete landslide.
Yeah. Well, elsewhere on the card, Dan, there was an exciting fight between Arslanbek Makhmudov and Guido Vianello. Please forgive me if I have butchered the pronunciation. Vianello. Okay.
This is going to be a boxing podcast video show. And also, I'll teach you how to say all the fighters' names. How about that?
Well, I'll say the home fighter was beaten by TKO according to Box right then. I haven't seen the full fight, but I have seen some of the highlights, and it looks like there was a very, very nasty eye at the end of the fight, his eye was completely and utterly shut. Just run us through that.
So the fight that you're speaking about, that is the heavyweight match between the home fighter, a Russian, but lives in the province of Quebec, named Arslanbek Makhmudov. People will know him a little bit because he did have a fight on one of the Saudi cards back in December, and he took an upset knockout loss to Ajit Kabayel, who dropped him 3 times, kind of made him quit to some degree. He came back after that. He got 1 win. Very big, strong guy, not fluid at all in terms of his boxing footwork and skills, but just a brute puncher. And they match him up with Guido Vianello, who's a much more of as heavyweights go, a smoother boxer, more of a boxer puncher, decent power. Both guys have great size, running like 6'6", 6'5" type height, 260, 240 for the other. For Makhmudov goes about 260 something, Vianello in the 240s. But good matchup. Like, you weren't sure who's going to win. Is it the puncher, the bigger puncher in Makhmudov? Is it the little more of the fluid guy in Vianello? They both had losses. I mentioned the knockout that Makhmudov took in December. Vianello had lost his previous fight on a split decision against another Olympian named Efe Ajagba. Vianello had been a Olympian for Italy. He had suffered a loss a couple fights before that, not because he got knocked out, but because of a cut against the journeyman Johnny Rice. So he had a couple of defeats on the record. So this was sort of like, with both guys having suffered those types of defeats, this was sort of like, lose or go home kind of fight. You know what I mean? Like, the guy that wins is fighting to stay relevant in the heavyweight division. And Guido Vianello did that, by the way. He fought a very good fight. He busted up Makhmudov's left eye. It looked like the swelling began in round 2. But by the time the fight was over, when the ref stopped it, it was his whole face basically was blown up. He couldn't see out of it at all. And so there was some drama from the standpoint that they were looking at the eye and trying to stop the swelling in the corner. And then they would call a timeout right after the next round started and have the doctor look at it, see if he could go on. And that happened, I think, a total of 3 times before finally when they called the timeout. The bell rang to start the 8th round, 2 seconds into the 8th round. And at that point, finally, the doctor and the ref had seen enough and they stopped the fight. So it was one of those things where, like we mentioned in the first fight, how does the fight go if the bicep doesn't tear for Derevyanchenko? You have to ask yourself, how does the fight go if the eye doesn't swell up so dramatically for Makhmudov? But I got the feeling that Vianello was definitely going to win that fight, just based on not just the eye, but just the overall skills, the game plan, the fluidity, just a better movement. And the interesting thing is, if you go back to 2015, these two guys had fought in the World Series of Boxing, and Makhmudov had scored a 4th round stoppage when Vianello had an ear injury. So for Vianello, it's sort of retribution. It's the revenge, and he keeps his career at the top level of the heavyweight division going. And you know what? Top Rank's going to get him a good fight, I think. I would mind seeing a rematch with Ajagba. They both, fought well in their fight against each other. It was very close, but he could also fit into the picture against any of the other guys in the heavyweight division that are maybe not at the level of the Fury and Usyk and Joshua, but the guys that are maybe that next step below. Match him up with any of those guys. He may lose, but he'll give all those guys a fight probably.
Yeah, when I was watching the highlights, it was plain to see that Vianello was just very much in control. There was a lot of hugging going on, a lot of and the speed punches were all in his favor. So, I mean, had he managed to last the full fight, it would have been probably a landslide points victory. But the stoppage came, and I think it's for everybody's benefit that was the case.
There was one point in that fight where Makhmudov appeared to score a knockdown, where he made Vianello touch his glove to the canvas, but the referee did not call the knockdown. But obviously, when you blow up the eye and the ref stops the fight, doctor calls for the fight to be stopped, that point that may have been given in that round didn't turn out to make a difference, obviously.
Yeah, I saw that in the 7th round, because I was going to ask you about that. Up next is that I've just got the screenshot paused now. He very clearly touches his glove down, but the referee's vision looks like it's on the left leg. So that's blocking his vision. So, I mean, is there any, not that it matters in this case, but should the fight have been close? Would there have been any contention over that? Like, would there have been any discussion? Because obviously we saw the instant replay in Las Vegas last week.
Yeah, that's all you can hope for, I guess, is that if the commission that you're fighting within uses replay, that at that point they would utilize it, like they did as the fight you mentioned from Las Vegas, where they do utilize replay. But replay is not used in every single commission, every jurisdiction. Obviously, if they had used it in Canada for that fight, they probably would have changed that particular call. But in this particular fight, like you said, it really turned out not to make it. So it didn't make any bit of difference in the result of the fight because the eye was such a problem that they had to stop it.
Just on that subject, because obviously where I am in England, we have football or soccer to you, and we've had VAR introduced, video assistant referee, a bit like in cricket where they have Hawkeye and tennis.
You're making an assumption I know anything about cricket.
Well, I don't, to be fair, but I just know that it's a system.
I'm gonna interject and give you a little quick cricket story.
Go on.
I come to England to cover a fight years ago. We were doing a broadcast for the Epics Network in the United States, and it was Carl Froch taking on Lucian Bute in Nottingham, England, and we're at the hotel. And me and one of my colleagues on the broadcast, we're getting a drink at the bar, and they got cricket on the TV. And I don't know. I mean, I've always been told cricket, it's kind of like baseball. In America, that's one of my favorite sports. I've watched it since I'm a kid. So the bartender lost me when he started to explain it to us a little bit. He was cool. Like he was like giving us the ins and outs of cricket, and it was sort of interesting, and it's on TV. And it was, I guess, the British team was, I forget what country they're playing, but they're playing like an important match or game, or whatever they call it. But when he told me that there was the possibility that the game could last for 4 days, kind of lost me right there. Because I'm thinking in baseball, you have extra innings, so it could go maybe last, an hour or two longer maybe, but it ain't going 4 days. And when I heard cricket could last like 4 days or however long it would be, I was done. So that's my cricket story.
I don't know much about cricket, but I know that they have test matches and they have whatever it is. But there are games where they can last several days. And then we have the Ashes, which is England v Australia for the tiny little trophy, which is highly contested. And we always tend to find that if it rains and it stops play and the time elapses from what they're allowed to play, that's it. There is no, we'll replay it. And I'm like, that just makes no sense to me because in this country, we have nothing but rain. So when we get Lancashire versus Yorkshire and it rains, it's just a complete waste of everyone's time. So that's my interpretation of cricket. But anyway, what I was getting at is with all these systems where somebody will watch a replay, and obviously in Las Vegas we've got the instant replay, and you said that they didn't. I don't think they implemented the score, the scoring the knockdown until after the 5th round. Was it last week?
Yeah, they had a little bit of a delay there, but at least in the end, the ultimate goal is to get the call right, and they did do that.
So, do you think that is something that's going to be implemented across the globe longer term? And do you want that, or do you think that is something that is going to be stick to certain cities, certain states, certain commissions?
I mean, you would hope that in a perfect world, in the Garden of Eden world, let's say, you would have every place where there's fights, if they have the ability to look at a replay of whatever the call may be, to get it right, because it happened. I mean, there was lots of resistance in America for different sports. They finally, years and years ago, implemented instant replay use for certain calls, not every single play, that it could happen in football, in our American football. They finally did it for certain things in baseball. And I think it's made it better because if the whole world sees on replays, you're watching on your device or on your couch, on your television, whatever the case may be, and then there's the replays that go up on the big screens in the arenas. I mean, I've seen where everybody and their mother knows that there was a knockdown, and the commission and or the referee is powerless to change a call. The referee's not doing it on purpose. I think the referees are trying to get the call right, but they're human beings and they're going to make a mistake once in a while on something like that. And so why not, get it right? That's the ultimate goal, is to make sure that it's done right. So the point is that if you can use video replay, if you're in you have to have TV cameras doing it. So for a small club show, obviously that's not going to happen. But if you're doing an event and you're on a broadcaster, if you're on ESPN like this fight was, if you're on, pay-per-view or on DAZN or on, some broadcaster, Sky Sports in the UK, TNT Sports, whatever the broadcaster is, they have, numerous camera angles and plenty of cameras and slow mode and, guys in the truck that they're able to look at those very quickly and make a determination. Now you're not going to be able to do it on every single, thing that happens in a boxing match, but the basic things, like if you go by the rules that they use in Nevada, like a knockdown is a clear thing. If a cut is caused by a punch or a headbutt, that is something that is reviewable. You have to have clear evidence. The standard form in America, let's say for American football, is, whatever the call that's made originally, if they look at the replay and they can't find substantial or clear evidence to overturn it, as they say, the call on the field stands. So if the ref calls it a knockdown and not a slip, and you can't see it 100%, it would just stay a knockdown. In the case of a cut, same situation. But yeah, I do think that if you got the technology and the fights are being televised or streamed or what have you, then yeah, by all means, you should do it. But in boxing, it did strike me as really unusual that they didn't get it right after the first round, and they waited to make that change until after the fifth round. That seems to be a bit much. It's supposed to get done on a more rapid basis. That 1 minute between rounds, thereabouts, is enough to look at a replay. So I didn't like I'm glad they got the call right, but I'm not glad it took, another 4 rounds for them to deal with it.
Yeah, right. Well, let's move on then to news elsewhere. So a bit of sad news. Luis Alberto Lopez has been confirmed that there was a small bleed on the brain after his defeat to Angelo Leo a couple of weeks back. What do you know about this, Dan, and what could be the consequence of this for him?
Well, first of all, he had that terrible knockout loss against Angelo Leo that cost him his IBF featherweight title. I guess you don't know for sure when the bleed occurred. It could have been on the knockout, which was such a titanic shot, yeah, because it was a double impact on the knockout, the punch, and then he hit his head on the canvas. But it could have happened at any time during the fight because they were swapping a lot of punches. But anyway, during the Mbilli and Derevyanchenko broadcast on ESPN, my buddy Mark Kriegel, who was one of the commentators and the reporter on the broadcast, they showed an interview that they had done post-fight with Angelo Leo to sort of catch up on what the week had been like since he'd been champ. And then he followed up saying that he had spoken to one of the managers for Luis Alberto Lopez, who had said that he had been diagnosed with a, quote, small brain bleed. He had spent about 6 hours in the Albuquerque hospital after the fight, had been released, and is obviously brain bleed or not, just on the knockout, he would be suspended medically by the New Mexico Commission, which he is. But they would have to submit to an MRI and a full exam. But the fact that he was even able to walk out of the hospital with a brain bleed 6 hours later is a testament to the fact that it wasn't, quote unquote, serious. Because brain bleeds, I mean, anybody that doesn't know this, when you die in a boxing match, like 99% of the fighters who've ever died from boxing, probably, it's because they've had some element of a brain bleed that causes them to go, lapse into a coma or be put into a medically induced coma. And that's what causes the damage, is the brain bleed. And obviously there's different levels of how large it is. In the case of Lopez, it seemed like it wasn't that big, but it is definitely something that they're going to be cautionary about if he's going to ever fight again. I mean, there's been fighters that have had brain bleeds who've survived and lived normal lives, but their careers were over because of that. And unfortunately, there's been fighters that have suffered those types of injuries where it's caused irrevocable harm and they may live, but they're, not in any kind of condition to care for themselves. If you use the example, probably the most famous example is the fight that took place many years ago in England, as a matter of fact, where Gerald McClellan was knocked out by Nigel Benn. He's still alive, but at what level of his life does he have? It's because he had a brain bleed. And then there's the other ones that have brain bleeds that are so severe that the fighter dies. And so, in Lopez's case, very fortunate and very happy that it was not as serious as that. But it will definitely call into question where he goes from here in terms of his future of his career.
Yeah, and before we move on to what happened in the Jake Paul Mike Tyson press conference on Sunday, we had a bit of news again, sad news, but nowhere near as sad as the previous topic. But Mairis Briedis has announced his retirement. Last time I saw him was an absolute wonderful scrap with Jaya Pattaya. It was the rematch over in Saudi Arabia. I was sort of up on the first tier at the Kingdom Arena and watched that, and it was a beautiful fight. Could have gone either way. I actually, going into that fight, had a feeling that Jaya Pattaya would just dominate him. Jaya Pattaya, when they first fought, obviously had the broken jaw. He's got better. He's more moving into his prime, and obviously Mairis Briedis getting older. But do you know what? He shocked us all, and it was an absolutely fantastic fight. And after given what Jaya Pattaya had been doing to some of his previous opponents, it was a really good fight. So it's a bit of a sad news to see. Obviously, he's getting on a bit now, so it was inevitable that he would retire. But he's one of the sort of generational boxers that you tip your hat to and respect, Dan. What are your experiences with Mairis Briedis and your reaction?
Well, I certainly don't look at it as sad. I look at it as a fighter that's had a heck of a career, that's done what he needed to do. He's been a champion. He's got a legacy that's set. He's made good money, and he's retired. I mean, it's a 15-year career. Like you said, boxing doesn't last forever. You know that going in. And so I actually view it more. I don't view it as sad. I view it as something to celebrate. That here's a man that still can compete at the highest level. That's obvious based on his most recent fight, and decided, you know what, enough is enough. I'm done. And he walks away on his own terms. He didn't let boxing retire him. He did it on his own. So after 15 years, here's a guy that will, in my opinion anyway, and I was thinking about this last night when I was writing my story about it, that there's no doubt in my mind, he is one of the top 10, maybe better, cruiserweights in the history of the weight class. The weight class obviously hasn't been around as long as some of the more traditional weight classes. Started in the early 1980s, but that's still a pretty good history. There's been a lot of great fighters that have come through that division. Remember, Briedis also fought a lot of his early career in the heavyweight division. He's got a knockout win against Makhmudov, who ended up fighting a lot of top names, and for what it's worth, became the WBA's regular title holder. But as his cruiserweight is where Briedis really came into his own. He won the lineal title. He won the WBO title. He won the WBC title. He won the IBF title. He got stripped of one of them for different reasons. He probably should have been able to have multiple unification fights. And if you look at the career he's had, in one of the losses, first of all, he's only got 3 losses. Two terrific and tough close fights against Opataya, and a majority decisional loss to Alexander Usyk in a unification fight that was in the semifinals of the first edition of the World Boxing Super Series. And if you ask me, he gave Usyk probably the toughest fight of his career, maybe except for the Fury fight. He gave him a really tough fight, and he absolutely could have won that night. And you're talking about Usyk, who is top of the food chain, 2-time, 2-division undisputed Olympic gold medalist. Many people look at him currently as the number 1 fighter pound for pound. And, Briedis essentially went straight up with the guy, not that many years ago. So he's had a heck of a career. He's fought a lot of good names. And you know what? If he decided he's done after the Opataya fight, he had been off for quite a while. Prior to that fight, he didn't fight at all. In 2023, he had injuries the same way Opataya did from their fight. Opataya was able to come back more quickly. But, Briedis got nothing to hang his hat about. He'll have a good legacy. And like I said, I think he's one of the top cruiserweights in the history of the division. And that's the division, by the way. When I say that, you're talking about, in no particular order, Usyk and Holyfield, David Haye, Marco Huck, Vasily Jirov. I mean, he's in that same conversation. Maybe he's not number 1 or 2, but, he's in the discussion.
Yeah, well, Maris Briedis, if you are, for whatever reason, watching this, we want to wish you all the best in whatever you do next. And thank you for a stellar career. And you've been a pleasure to watch. From one stellar career to another then, Dan, Mike Tyson is getting back in the ring. We sort of knew it was coming. We worried. Well, we were worried. We hoped it'd get called off because I worry what's going to happen in there. I hope he shocks the world. Not that I want Jake Paul to lose. I just think that Mike Tyson at 60-odd years of age should not be doing this.
He's only 58. Come on, give him a break.
Is he 50? I thought he was going in there at 60, or is he not?
No, 58.
Oh, well, he's near 60 then. He should absolutely not be doing this. Maybe get Floyd Mayweather in there. That's more of a realistic proposition. Not weight-wise, but...
Well, Floyd's got his exhibition coming up this weekend.
Well, one of the questions that's come in is on that. So that's one I'm going to ask you about. But they had the press conference on Sunday, the second press conference for it. Mike Tyson he didn't really have much of an answer to many of the questions other than, I'm going to knock you out, I'm going to F you up and all this lot. Jake Paul was talking the talk as he always does. If you watched the press conference, Dan, and I don't blame you if you didn't, what did you take from it and what are your sort of expectations of this?
I did not watch the full press conference. I did watch some clips. They had already a previous two-city tour before the fight was postponed. I did watch those. I'm good. I didn't need to see another one. I could catch the highlights. But your comment about Mike didn't have much to say about this, that, or the other. I mean, I covered Mike Tyson when he was still an active, actual heavyweight fighter, and he didn't really usually have a lot to say in press conferences anyway. Now he might do a bit more in terms of like if you had interviews with him and we used to do these group sessions with him where they take a few of the reporters to his hotel room and we'd sit around and he would give you like the stream of consciousness for a half an hour. But at a press conference, he was terrible. But in that type of situation I just mentioned, he was outstanding. So at the press conference, and keep in mind, by the way, this was taking place not at a...
Oh, just lost Dan briefly. Let's get him back.
There we go. I'm back.
There we go. This was taking place not at a... When's when I lost you?
They were doing this press conference at this sports sort of industry thing. I don't know what the Fanatics Festival at the Jacob Javits Center in New York City. So along with the press conference as being one aspect of it, they had memorabilia and apparel and other things for sale and autograph signings and that sort of stuff. And so there was not a lot of like quote unquote real media that was there to ask them questions about their fight. It was more of sideshow type stuff. The press conferences they did on their tour, which also maybe lacked for like bona fide mainstream media, but there was some at least. This was, I think, much less than that. So what happened at a press conference, I don't really make much of it. I mean, look, they're trying to drum up interest. They're getting a huge amount of money from Netflix to do this fight. Netflix expects them to promote it and to bring eyeballs to that platform for this event. And as it grows closer in November, when it actually is still scheduled to happen, I mean, there's still a lot of discussion. Will it actually take place? I mean, who the heck knows? But when and if it does happen, it's going to have a tremendous amount of attention on it, a huge amount of eyeballs on it. A lot of people are going to fill that stadium to see. I don't think a real boxing match. I mean, if you're going expecting to see like Usyk and Fury, or Lopez against Angelo Leo, or Mbilli against Derevyanchenko, like a real fight between actual bona fide guys that are close at least to their heydays of being fighters, then you're barking up the wrong tree. It's a sideshow, and I'm not saying that like in a negative way. As the kids say, Seb, it is what it is.
Do you think it would be more like the Hatton versus Barrera exhibition match in Manchester a couple of years back?
I mean, we see exhibitions all the time. I mean, Mike Tyson engaged in an exhibition, with Roy Jones a couple of years ago. The reason why this is a little different is because when you mention Jones and Tyson, or you mention Hatton and Barrera, or other types of exhibitions that would fall into a similar category, that's two retired legends in with each other, where they're not supposed to be trying for knockouts. They're trying to put on a show. Everybody knows there's not like real scoring going on. They want to see these guys do their thing, mostly for the aspect of nostalgia. This is unfortunately sanctioned as a quote unquote real fight. Now there are a few rule adjustments. Instead of doing 3-minute rounds, as is typical for a male fight, they've done 2-minute rounds for this. It's an 8-rounder. They're going to wear larger gloves, 14 ounces instead of 12 ounces for heavyweights. But I did see a part of the press conference that you mentioned on Saturday, where Jake Paul and Tyson were going back and forth with each other, and Jake was saying, "Let's do it 3. Let's do 3-10. 3 and 10." That ain't going to happen, because even if he agrees to it, the commission in Texas probably would put the kibosh on that to begin with. So, look, it's a supposed real fight, but Mike hasn't had an actual boxing match. He's had 2 actual exhibitions since his retirement. One was, not that long after his retirement, and one was the Roy Jones one that was back just a couple of years ago. That means he hasn't had a real fight in it'll be about 20 years since that last fight. 2005 was his last fight, which I covered. I mean, it feels like a lifetime ago. And he was no good then. I mean, and I'm not knocking Tyson. I love Tyson. I mean, he's my childhood, as a teenager, let's say, heavyweight champion, and he was the biggest thing since sliced bread. And he came from an area where I grew up, in Catskill, New York, where he fought out of, and he fought so many of those early fights of his career in the capital region of New York State, in Albany and Glens Falls and Schenectady and Troy. Like, that was where I grew up. So he was always in the news from day one. So we all knew Tyson. We loved Tyson. So when I say that he's washed up or he can't do anything, I'm not trying to make it like I'm against Mike Tyson. But the simple fact is, the people remember or see the clips, the endless loops of highlights of him destroying, Trevor Berbick, or some of the big knockouts, Tyrell Biggs or Tony Tubbs, or, you pick a fight, even a fight he lost, but a great fight against Buster Douglas, or seeing the tremendous matchups against Razor Ruddock. And then the post-prison, where he did score some knockouts against guys, like the 1-round knockout against, Bruce Seldon, or, making Frank Bruno look like he was going to shit his pants because he was so scared to be in there in their rematch, knocked him out as he did in the first fight. Anyway, when I came on the boxing beat and started to cover Tyson, he was at the very end. So I was watching the completely washed up Tyson get knocked out. I saw him, I think he only won, one fight that I was at. He had one was a no contest, which he won, but turned out to be a no contest because of a positive drug test for marijuana against Andrew Galata. I was there when he got destroyed by Lennox Lewis, destroyed by Danny Williams, destroyed by Kevin McBride. And I did see him get the one victory against who was it against? Against Clifford Etienne, 30-second knockout or so. But anyway, the point is, 20 years ago when I was covering Tyson, he was washed up and could no longer fight, no longer had the heart to fight. And that's the Tyson that I remember because it was personal to me because I was there. So to think that 20 years later he's going to compete against Jake Paul, and I say what you want about Jake. People like to diminish him. He's not a real fighter. He's only fought, guys who are, MMA fighters or, washed up, guys from other sports, like whether Nate Robinson, who was a basketball player, he did take 2 fights against lower level boxers. But he's 27, right? He's in his prime physically. Well, I don't care what you say about the fights that he's had. He's got a good right hand. He's got power. And Tyson's the one that had to pull out because he's got he had an ulcer. I mean, he had health issues. I mean, the whole thing is sort of very, it's fucked up is the bottom line. I mean, but if it happens, it happens. I mean, I'm not the commission, and, no one's forcing Mike to do this, as he said in multiple of his interviews, as well as at the press conference. People ask him, why are you doing this? Because I can. Because why not? I can make a shitload of money, and I can, go in there and try to compete, test myself. And what else am I doing with my life? I mean, so he still does have, I guess, after all these years, where when he quit boxing, said, and I can remember very vividly because I interviewed him, in the aftermath of that McBride fight that night, sitting with him for like a half an hour. And all he did was talk about he didn't have the heart to fight anymore, and he didn't want to do it anymore. And he didn't like the smell of the gym, and he never wanted to put gloves on again and all that kind of stuff. And that's fresh in my mind when this comes up. But after 20 years, maybe he got the itch again.
Well, certainly with Jake Paul claiming he's going to get $40 million for the fight, whether Mike Tyson gets the same or somewhere near. I mean, any million is going to tempt anybody.
Listen,
Dan.
I can assure you that Netflix, as well as I do, if Netflix wasn't there to write the check, they'd have put this on pay-per-view or just not done it. So if they were basically letting Netflix buy them out of what would have been an enormous pay-per-view event, Netflix, and Netflix is obviously a very wealthy outlet, and they have tremendous number of subscribers around the world. To be able to bring this type of name fight, whatever you think of the merit of the match, but just the names involved, and it's not pay-per-view. And by the way, they're putting Katie Taylor and Amanda Serrano's rematch on the undercard. If that was just going to be on its own, I can guarantee you that they would have done that as a pay-per-view after what happened in that first fight that they had. So the fact that Netflix can do this as a non-pay-per-view tells you 1,000,000% they're spending tens of millions of dollars to own the rights to this. If Jake says he's making 40, Tyson's no chump. He's not coming for 5. I can promise you that. So the combination of massive rights fee from Netflix, plus it's an 80,000 or, I don't know the stadium can hold like 100,000. They're going to scale it, I think, for around 80 or so. And I have no doubt that they're going to have either a capacity or close to capacity. The gate will be, now you can't charge crazy prices for the nosebleed seats, but you got to figure that there's a really good chance that kind of fight is going to generate a $10 million gate, something like that, maybe a little more depending on I haven't seen what the tickets are scaled at specifically. Not to mention the sponsorship opportunities that are going to be there for the folks involved to get other sponsors to put their names on the logo and on the logos on the ring mats and all that business, and the international and whatever t-shirts and hats and all that stuff. There's a lot of money in the fight. So I'm not surprised if Jake's going to make that kind of bread. And by the way, if you're Jake Paul, why wouldn't you take the fight, win or lose? It's like Floyd Mayweather. I remember Floyd saying this to me years ago. When he was questioned about taking a certain fight or not taking a certain fight, the amount of money. He goes, when you're making that kind of money, there ain't no losers. It's the truth.
In terms of the fight itself, then, do you expect a winner? Do you have a prediction in mind, or how it's going to go? And regardless of that, what next for Jake Paul? Will the gravy train roll? He lost against Tommy Fury and carried on, and now he's fighting Mike Tyson.
I mean, listen, the fight's still not till November, but I think, you could have told me or anybody, 6 months ago, a year ago, that and I'm maybe biased because I still remember seeing Tyson quit and get knocked out in those late fights, that he's not the guy that he was when he was the baddest man on the planet. It's hard for me to pick a Tyson against a young 27-year-old man who is maybe not the greatest boxer, but he's been in the gym. He's been putting in the work. He does have a nice record, 10-1. The Tommy Fury was the one quote unquote real fighter that it lost. It was close, but it's hard to pick against him when the opponent is a washed up 58-year-old who had to take time off because of an ulcer, who may look spectacular doing, 20-second Instagram reels, hitting the mitts, which is not reality. Reality is in this case, a 2-minute round where you got a 27-year-old guy throwing punches at your head and you can't stop and have them reshoot the scene to make it look good for Instagram.
Exactly. Right, Dan, it's that time of the show where we're going to do some Q&A. We've got a fair few questions come in. I've also got some written down from last week's show. So if anybody's watching and you do have a question for Dan, we are doing an Ask Me Anything. As long as it's not too ridiculous, I will try and get that in.
I have to leave it to you to edit that to make it so it's not that ridiculous,
Well,
because I'm not seeing the questions. I'm relying on you. Some people can see it.
I'm going to read them and I'm going to make sure it's not too ridiculous. I'm only going to ask you what I think is suitable. Right, Dan, first question then from Victor Senior. It says, how did Dan get into boxing? What's the background, Dan?
Well, we could talk for a while about that, but I'll try to give you the short version. First of all, the short version is, like a lot of kids, I'm going to turn 54 years old later this month. So for people of my age, I grew up watching boxing on network television in the late 1970s and early 1980s. And I grew up in a place where it was cold weather in upstate New York. And when it's the weekend and you're not in school and you can't be running around outside, or even if you go outside to play in the snow, you're not out there for too long. So you're in the house and you might sit down and have lunch at the kitchen table and pop the TV on. And back in those days, not like today, there was boxing on. We had three or four TV channels. Boxing sometimes might be on 2 of them at the same time, on ABC's Wide World of Sports or on CBS or NBC. And so I would watch. I saw boxing matches on the little black and white TV at my kitchen table in my mom's house where I grew up. And I saw fighters in no particular order, but Sugar Ray Leonard and Ray Mancini and Alexis Arguello, and fighters from that era, Larry Holmes. This again, late 70s, early 80s, and I became a boxing fan, more of a baseball fan, but became an even bigger boxing fan, later in the 80s. And Tyson was a big part of that. We just spent a lot of time talking about Iron Mike when, in 1986 when he won the heavyweight championship. I was in high school, and like I said, he came from our area where he trained and where he lived in upstate New York. Everybody was a Tyson fan. The whole town. The adults and the kids, the teachers, you'd see it on the local news, you'd see it in the local newspaper. And so that's how I got to be a boxing fan. And obviously later I became a sports writer, and, that's another long story, how it became from writing sports to writing boxing. But in terms of being a boxing fan, I was watching those fights in the late 70s, early 80s.
Right. Next one. We'll get straight into the boxing questions then. So this one is a question. It says, do you think Turki Al-Sheikh's support will continue in the long term or just for the short term?
That's a good question. I mean, the Saudis have their reasons for being in the sport. I don't think it's specifically to quote unquote make money. I don't know what the end game is, but it is my belief, my understanding, seeing how they've operated in terms of what they're doing in other sports. They're all about bringing attention in a positive light to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, both in terms of making people have a positive feeling about it if you're just watching and seeing it, or perhaps to convince you to go visit their country. Riyadh season is a big part of that. Show the world that we have the ability to host people and have great resorts and have great places to eat and great entertainment, great sports, great facilities, modern things that you can get in other places. But come here, we offer lots of great things and amenities, and that's a big part of it. So does that last for the long term? I don't know. Nobody's the Saudi government's not bringing me under their wing and telling me what their grand plans are. But I would say if you're a boxing fan, definitely enjoy it while you can in terms of the fights, because whatever your thoughts are about Turkey, about Saudi Arabia in general, as just in terms of focus strictly on boxing, they are making fights that fans want to see. I mean, they're making a bunch of fights. We can go down the laundry list of fights that probably wouldn't have happened if not but for their large bankroll that they seem to be wanting to spend on it now. So I look at it like this: whereas the traditional promoter, Eddie Hearn and Frank Warren and Bob Arum and Al Heyman / Tom Brown and Oscar De La Hoya and the major promoters in the sport, They operate where it's like, can we put on an event and spend X because we can bring in revenue that's Y, that's greater than X. Pay all the bills, pay the fighters, and we make money. That's not the Saudi game here. And that's what people are still having a hard time wrapping their mind around. I view it as this. Take the Super Bowl, biggest TV show in the world every year. In America anyway, if you're a company and you want to advertise your product, whatever it is, your widget, your whatever, your movie, it's like $7 million for a 30-second ad. But you don't necessarily, you can't calculate the return on that investment. What the Saudis are doing in boxing is like that on steroids. Plow in hundreds of millions of dollars to let people know about our product. Their product is Saudi Arabia, and they're trying to convey that via the boxing matches they put on. So they're not in it to make a quote-unquote profit the way the promoters are that I mentioned. Now, I don't think they want to lose $1 billion, but if they put on an event and it loses X, I mean, it's not a big deal for them. They literally have almost a limitless amount of money they could spend. Obviously, there is some budget that they stick to, but that's really something that could be ripped up in 2 seconds if the leaders of their country decide to give their General Entertainment Authority more money, which is the outfit that is run by Turki Al-Sheikh. So, the long-term, short-term, I don't know the answer to that. But for now, we're getting fights like Tyson Fury, Usyk 1 and 2. We saw, other fights involving Anthony Joshua. We just saw a big show with Crawford and Makhmudov. And it's not just the main event fights. It's the way they do the full undercards we talked about. We saw Opataya and Myris Briedis on an undercard. Like, that's amazing to me. That's a main event fight, in every other era of boxing. So the answer is not known. I mean, if you've got Turkey's number and you can call him up and ask him, maybe he'll tell you.
Question from Sam W. Then it says, why does Turki Al-Sheikh refuse to do business with Tim Tszyu?
I don't think that's entirely true. It may seem like that. From what Turkey had messaged to me was that there's some it's not a thing about Tszyu. There may have been some type of so-called miscommunication with Tim's team, and I do think based on that back and forth that I did have with Turkey, that they're open to doing something with him in the future. It's not going to be in the immediate future because Tim is going to have a fight later in the fall that's going to take place against Bakram Murtazaliyev for the IBF 154-pound title. But after that, it wouldn't be a shock to me if they did find a way to work together. But we'll have to wait and see. But I don't think it's a matter of I won't do business with Tim Tszyu or his team. I don't think that's the case at all.
Next question then from the same person. What is the latest outlook on the Charlo brothers? Are they essentially done with boxing?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I wish I knew the answer to that. Both of them, Jermell and Jamal, have been very good fighters in their time. They both won world championships. Jermell was undisputed at junior middleweight. Jamal, reigned for quite a while with the middleweight title. As a matter of fact, at one time, they both won titles. So, together they held titles in the junior middleweight division, which had never happened for twins before, which is pretty amazing when you think about it. But they've had their outside the ring issues of varying degrees. And, neither guy has been active. They're, in the case of Jermell, he is coming off of the loss to Canelo Alvarez that was pretty one-sided, although way out of his normal weight class. Jamal's had his own issues. So I don't think there's anything specific for them. The PBC people that I talked to have said to me, like, they're waiting for them to decide what they want to do. And when they're ready to come back, we'll do something with them. I've seen there's been some of the conversation that Jamal he'll go to the gym and it'll be conversation like, I'm ready to come back and let's get to work. And then he won't show up for a few days. And so, nobody's sure if he's still serious about it. So, I just hope the two guys can get their lives and careers together, because to be honest, if they can come back and fight in their proper weight class and get some kind of momentum, they're good for the game from that standpoint. They are polarizing, but polarizing is not bad. Polarizing just means people care one way or the other.
Question from Itachi. It says, Dan, who is your favorite Aussie boxer of all time?
Aussie boxer of all time? Let's see. That's a good. Well, I guess I'd have to go with Tim Tszyu. Not Tim Tszyu. My bad. I have to go with that. I'm dating myself. I got to go with Costa Tszyu. Now, I know he's born in Russia, but he fought about Australia for his whole career and had a lot of his fights in Australia. Just I got a chance to cover him during his career. Fantastic fighter, very serious man, and a terrific fighter, terrific amateur, and to me, one of the great junior welterweights of all time.
Question. This is in reference to we were talking about Mayweather before. This says, "Hi Dan, Benito here, loyal Fight Freaks and Bet US listener each week. Dan, what are your thoughts on the fight of the year with a laughing emoji, Mayweather Jr. versus Gotti this Saturday night?"
Well, I got to give the shout out. Anybody that's a follower of my Fight Freaks Unite Substack and watches our Bet US handicapping show on Fridays, I got to give my tip the hat to that. In terms of the quote on fight of the year, I mean, I saw that first, I don't know what you want to call it, where the fight was stopped because they were like shouting at each other. They had taken a warning from the referee, Kenny Bayless. And when it was stopped, remember, it's an exhibition, so they weren't scoring it, obviously, but Floyd was doing his thing. And it turned into like this crazy melee, crazy brawl, and it was just absolute chaos and pandemonium. And so now, for whatever reason, they're doing a rematch of a fight that no one asked for in the first place. John Gotti has a handful of MMA fights. His only reason that he's in this is because his grandfather is the famous gangster John Gotti. I mean, that's it. I mean, so to me, the whole thing is an absolute farce. It's one thing if Jake Paul is fighting Tyson. Jake has got 11 pro fights. He's, been in the spotlight in boxing. Tyson is Tyson. You talked about some other exhibitions we've seen, even from some of Floyd Mayweather's other exhibitions. They've come against like an MMA fighter or something like that. At least guys that were involved at a higher level. This is just, I don't even know what to call this. It's just, I'm at a loss for words. I don't take it seriously. I'm not even sure I'm going to watch it, to be quite honest with you. When you have Victor Ortiz on the undercard, also in an exhibition, that leaves me kind of like, why would anybody why is Victor in an exhibition anyway? So it's not like they loaded up an undercard to make it like worth the money, $50-$60, whatever they're charging on pay-per-view for it. So, buy at your own, you've been warned. Buyer beware, I guess, is the way to look at it.
Is this the same fight that Floyd Mayweather didn't turn up to the press conference to a couple of months back?
Yeah, I think it is, actually. Now, this fight also is in Mexico. So yes, they found some other sucker to bankroll it in some other country, because Floyd's had exhibitions in America. He's at exhibitions in England. He's at exhibitions in Japan. At some point, he'll probably run out of people that will be willing to put up a lot of money for him to just show up and not do a whole lot in the ring. I mean, I don't get it. I mean, I was interested like anybody in the first few times. Was like, all right, Floyd's going to do his thing, and okay, let me check it out. But it got to a point where they're not entertaining. That's the bottom line. Like, I saw exhibitions. Who's the dude? Aaron Chalmers or something like that in England?
Yeah.
I'd rather go mow my lawn or wash my hair. I mean, it was just like, please, who got time for that shit? Much less spending pay-per-view money on it. So, if he can find people that want to put up money to stick him in the ring for an appearance where he's not going to exert himself and he's clearly not going to lose any kind of fight, I don't have any problem with Floyd making money. But to me, I scratch my head and like, who are the people that are buying this or watching this? Because they're not entertaining for the most part. That's the problem. I mean, if they were at least fun to watch, that might be a different story. So I don't know. I don't really quite get this whole thing. And this is going to be, I want to say it's like his 8th exhibition since his retirement following the victory against Conor McGregor, which is back, in 2017. So he's been at this exhibition thing, for the last number of years. And, every once in a while he'll pop up and do one. And, as he says, rob the bank and move on. But anybody that would buy this expecting, if you want to see a freak show, by all means, have at it. And they have actually a decent, one of the undercard fights is a decent fight with David Picasso against Azat Hovhanessian, which is like an actual fight. That's actually a pretty good matchup. But the rest of what I've seen is sort of like, I have no idea why you're buying this. No.
Well, we're going to move on to a former opponent of Floyd Mayweather. 2 questions on this person. It says, "What's up, guys? Is the Canelo versus Berlanga fight Canelo's 3rd and final fight with PBC? If so, does it look like all roads lead to Turki Al-Sheikh if he wants to continue making these huge paydays?"
Well, the characterization is in error, because yes, it is his 3rd consecutive fight with PBC, but he's been doing one-off fights with them. Originally, he did the 3-fight deal. When the next fight couldn't be arranged, that contract ended, and he went out and he ended up going back with PBC and did a 1-fight deal. So this is actually his 3rd fight in a row, each on what amounted to a 1-fight deal. He did, the Charlo fight was the first fight. Then there was a lot of issues about the rematch and who we would fight after that. There were suggestions she would fight Charlo, which nobody wanted to see. Even Canelo didn't want to do that fight because there was just no interest from anybody in that. So the Jermell fight was the first one. Then they ultimately came to the agreement to do the Munguia fight. That was the second fight. And now this fight between him and Berlanga is the third fight, but each is on a one-fight deal. So when this is over, he's free and clear to go and do his own thing. Now, he may stay with PBC and just do whatever the next fight's going to be, or he can move on and potentially talk to Turkey, but they've had their back and forth, their words with each other. But the bad feelings and the words with each other are only going to last until they decide that they're not going to last. You know what I mean? Like, if there's a movement after this fight where he wants to talk to the Saudis about doing something, then maybe that will happen. Canelo has made it very clear. It's not that he's opposed to doing business with them and with Turkey. It's that he did not want to go start to talk about and try to organize or arrange or negotiate a fight with Terrence Crawford in particular that would take place in February, while he was still, a few weeks away from having a fight with Edgar Berlanga. His thing was, look, I'm going to do this fight, and then maybe we can talk. And he also, I guess, didn't like the way that he was approached. I mean, Canelo, like any top athlete, top fighter, they have a certain ego, certain things, certain ways they want to be treated. So maybe there was a little bit of stuff lost in translation, so to speak. But look, at the end of the day, if Canelo wins the fight against Berlanga and the Crawford fight's still something that Turkey wants to pursue and that Crawford's interested in, and they can convince Canelo of it, perhaps there can be a meeting of the minds and they'll make the match, or some other fight. Who knows?
Well, the next question on the Canelo subject is from Majid. It says, my question is, would you rather see Canelo Benavidez or AJ Fury? I think the former for you being American. Am I right?
No, because I've never, ever, people make that mistake all the time. I've never viewed the fights I'm interested in, literally has never once had anything to do with like that we're from the same country. It's just not, I just don't think that way. So, I mean, if Fury beats Usyk in the rematch, I'd rather see the heavyweight fight, to tell you the truth. Now, don't get me wrong. I love the Canelo and Benavidez fight. Absolutely. I've been writing about it and calling for it for years. I mean, I was driving that bandwagon. But if it's a binary choice, and I can only pick one, and both guys are coming off, their wins, and it can be for undisputed in the heavyweight division. Obviously, if AJ defeats Daniel Dubois, he'll have picked up the IBF belt. I mean, maybe the undisputed aspect is a little bit overrated because Usyk already had it. But if Fury beats Usyk in the rematch and gets those belts back, and Joshua was successful, the belt's just part of it, but they'll both be coming off big wins. Absolutely, that's a spectacle fight. And don't get me wrong, Canelo and Benavidez is a great fight, a huge fight also. But Fury and Joshua has been percolating for, a decade? I mean, it's about time these dudes fight. I mean, all due respect to Benavidez, but that fight's only been a thing for a couple of years.
Yeah, and hopefully if they do fight Fury and AJ, it's not when they're both past their prime.
I have an idea for you, Seb.
Go on.
Maybe we can talk Turkey with all that money they have. They can do Usyk and Fury. I mean, not Usyk and Fury. Do Tyson, Fury, and Joshua on the same card with Canelo and Benavidez.
Do a tag team. Can have Canelo and AJ versus Benavidez and Fury. Oh dear. Right, let's have a look then. What else we've got? Right, John Mack asked. This question came in while we were talking about the instant replay chat before. Okay. So this question says, should the judges be watching the broadcast for a clearer view, especially when the action is often on the opposite side of the ring?
No, they shouldn't. That's the whole point. I mean, the reason why they scatter the judges around the ring is because there's going to be different angles that they see. They have a great seat. They're not impeded by fans or media or cameras or anything. They're right there on the ring apron, and they have a clear view. And it's absolutely, and as somebody that has sat at ringside for a very long time, yes, sometimes fights look different on TV than they do in front of you in terms of the actual people. But you can see, hear, feel more than when you're not watching on a monitor. Like there are times, like to me in boxing, and I learned the methods of scoring, if you will, from the great Harold Letterman, who was for many, many years, the late Harold Letterman, Hall of Famer, was the unofficial scorer for HBO, for a long time. And the biggest thing about professional boxing is clean, effective punching. That's the number one scoring criteria. Who's doing the damage? When you're sitting ringside and not watching on a monitor, you can feel and hear and see the damage that's being done. It's not like watching a television where you see a punch land and you have no idea of the quality of the punch. You know the quantity of the punches that are being thrown. But when you're ringside and you're looking at the people in the ring, you get that you can feel the impact sometime of certain shots, and you know who's doing the more damage. And that to me is why you're never going to have judges strictly watching on a monitor. You're going to watch them in the ring. That's why the judges sit ringside. That's why they're on three sides to get a different angle, because there's different things they'll see. And if everybody's watching the exact same thing, who's to say that the camera's picking up everything you need to see anyway? So I totally reject that. It's always going to be better if you're watching it live with your naked eye and seeing the people right in front of you.
Just to follow up then, a question for me on this. Would boxing benefit from having a fourth judge who is watching the broadcast to judge based on the broadcast to see how different the scoring is? Because we often see, like, during the broadcast, they will say, oh, such a body back in the studio, this is their scorecard, and flash it up on screen, which generally looks nothing like what the judges get. So is there any interest in that?
I don't think that's a terrible idea. What's the terrible idea is to have an even number of judges, because that's going to definitely make it more likely there to be a draw. I've always been and again, this was way before that, I had like involvement in terms of as a reporter. But when they changed boxing from 15-round fights to 12-round fights, it always struck me as unusual as why they didn't change it to like a 13-round fight or an 11-round fight, to at least have an odd number of rounds, which would theoretically create a less of a chance for there to be a draw. They can't eliminate it, obviously, and certainly in the 12-round fights we don't see that many draws. But but by having an even number of judges, to me that would make it where there's a more of a likelihood where two judges could have one score and two judges have the other, and now you're going to wind up with more draws. So, if you're going to make more judging, I would definitely advocate for there to be a fifth judge, not a fourth judge. Now, the WBC and Mauricio Suleiman has tried to start that conversation and make a move to try to get more judges. To me, it's not about having more judges. It's about having judges that are, I won't even say better, but who have the same scoring criteria, who follow a same way that they're supposed to score the fight, and don't leave it as open-ended as it is, or perhaps, and I know there's been efforts in the past to loosen up the scoring system. You can, like we talked about, certain fights where nothing really happens in the first round, and it's a total feeling out round, and maybe one guy lands like a nice body shot in the last couple seconds of the round. That's basically how Terrence Crawford won the first round against Makhmudov. Nothing happened, and he landed a couple of shots like in the last couple seconds, and because nothing happened, that was like enough to shade the round 10-9 for Crawford. Now you move further into the fight, and it's back and forth. There's a lot of stuff going on, and maybe a guy has a big round but doesn't score a knockdown, but he clearly is the winner of the round. It's still 10-9. And when you add up the math, it's still the same in terms of the scoring. But if you watch each individual 3-minute segment, one round, nothing happened except for like a little bullshit punch at the end of the round, but it's enough to win the round. And the other one was like he's beating the shit out of the guy. He just doesn't score a knockdown, and it's still 10-9. So if they liberalize the way you score a fight, maybe 8.5 points, maybe you can be more liberal with the use of a 10-8 round, where if it's a heavy one-sided round, you don't have to have a knockdown. And by the way, there's nothing in the rule book that says just because you get a knockdown that it has to be 10-8, because it's conversely what I just mentioned. You could beat the shit out of a guy and not knock him down, and a judge is going to probably go 10-9. Every now and again, I've done this, and other judges have done this, where it's such a heavy damage round without a knockdown that the score still is 10-8, even without the knockdown. But by the same token, you could have a round that's the opposite, where you could score a knockdown in an otherwise nothing round, or the other guy does a great work and comes back strong or does his own damage. Why should that guy get the benefit of a 10-8 round just because he had a knockdown, but otherwise, got the stuffing beat out of him? So you can do that on both versions of that kind of round. So I do think the key to making scoring better is however you decide to do it. It's not about so much adding additional judges who are still going to probably just fuck things up. It's about getting the judges that you do have and getting them on the same playing field, getting them the same mindset of what is going to make the difference and why you would score this 10-9, 10-8, or create a way where you're going to liberalize the usage of the 10-point must system, where, the example I gave, a quiet round that's 10-9 compared to a heavier action round that's still 10-9, but it's clear to the naked eye that so much more is happening in terms of what's landing in the more dominating round, where there's a lot more punches. So that to me is a better way to go about it than just simply, throwing a couple more judges at ringside.
Tom Loeffler spoke to our reporter, Aaliyah Roscoe. The interview I haven't published it yet, so we're having a bit of a peek behind the curtain here. But he spoke to her on the back of the Ortiz-Boachuk fight for a second time after we did our show last week. He basically said the judges should be accountable, and why does nobody ever speak to the judges? Why are the judges not allowed to be interviewed after a fight? Do you have an opinion on it? Do you think that should be changed, or do you think that the judges should be kept away from the media?
No, I agree. I agree with Tom in that sense. I mean, Tom and I don't agree on everything, but in that, absolutely. I mean, don't get me wrong. The people like myself who've been ringside for years covering boxing at the highest level have endeavored to talk to the judges. The commission often won't allow them. Sometimes the executive director of a commission will come back and make a comment about, but is not going to let you talk to the judge. My perspective is, if you don't want to do like a full press conference, like, okay, I'm not trying to like cause massive trouble, but I think it's not appropriate, not inappropriate to do, like, at the very, very least. And this is something that happens sometimes in Major League Baseball, for example, a pool reporter. One reporter goes and asks questions of the official and then shares what the quotes are and the comments for everybody. So, if one outlet goes and gets the comments, everybody, they're dispersed to everybody. So they can appear in all publications or broadcasts or whatever. So that would be, to me, something that could be done. Why should they be exempt from being held accountable for their scoring? It does drive me crazy. And a lot of times, even when the executive director of whatever commission will come out to speak, basically they're not there to really answer the question. They're there to defend their employees. They're there to defend their judges. I mean, I worked a lot over the years when Bob Bennett was the executive director of the Nevada State Athletic Commission. I had a very good relation with Bob, got along great with Bob, dealt with him a lot over the years. But it always was a sore spot, because whenever there was some type of judging controversy, think back to Canelo Alvarez, the wacky score that one of the judges gave him a draw. I believe it was in the Mayweather fight, or go to the fights that he had. Certainly the first fight against Gennady Golovkin, where there was a lot of uproar because that fight was ruled a draw, and pretty much everybody had Triple G winning the fight. Bob would basically come out and defend the judge. He would never allow that judge. He just couldn't get with it and say, look, it was a bad night. I mean, to me, I think people are more forgiving. You're just honest about it. But yeah, I agree with Tom. Absolutely, judges should be held accountable, and it would be good for everybody if they would be able to have their say with the press. And keep in mind, it's not that the media, it's not that we're special. We are the conduit to the fan, to the public. We're the person that goes to ask the question. We're like the representative of the public. That's how I view my job, is you ask the questions that you think that anybody would want to ask. So if you see a terrible scorecard, particularly in such a big fight, why should they be any different than anybody else? Be accountable. What did you see? Maybe you can convince me why you scored it your way. All I know is this: I've seen way too many fights where me and basically every other media person, the broadcasters, and fans at large have it one way. Maybe not the exact same score, but I always talk about the range of acceptable scores within a 6, 7-5, 8-4, whatever your number is. And then the judges have it completely different. That's a problem with the sport, big time.
Next question then, Dan. So we've got a question from Benito Gonzalez Jr. Now this says, how true are the reports that Crawford Madrimov did less than 200,000 pay-per-view buys? Pro Box founder Gary Jonas told the Boxing Voice podcast those numbers. What are your thoughts?
My thoughts are that Gary is right. That fight absolutely did less than 200,000 buys. I am told that fight probably didn't even actually hit 150. It's probably more in that, say, 135, 140 type range at best. And that's the reality. So, they don't report the numbers. And when I say that, that's in the United States. That's always been the apples to apples comparison. I'm not speaking about if it was on pay-per-view in the UK or wherever else DAZN is in. In the United States, that would be the number. And that would be comparable. If you take a look at some of the previous examples, again, apples to apples in America, of what Terrence Crawford's limited number of pay-per-view fights have done. For example, the big fight he had in Las Vegas against Errol Spence, that fight did around probably a shade less than 700,000 buys. And if you go back to some of his earlier fights on pay-per-view, the Sean Porter fight, for example, which was only available if you subscribe to ESPN Plus, and then on top of that had to buy it, was not available on satellite or on basic cable at all in terms of a pay-per-view. That fight did not reach 100,000 buys. He had a pay-per-view on, years before that against Victor Postal. Was lucky to probably do 50,000 buys. Similar numbers with the Amir Khan fight, less than 100,000 or so, maybe about 100,000. So this was, in that ballpark. And from Crawford's perspective, if you come off such a mega win and such a big pay-per-view, I have to say that number is disappointing.
Question from Matador 4. It says, why didn't Benavidez force his mandatory status on Canelo? He never officially enforced the WBC to do that for him. Instead, he keeps the light heavyweight interim belt. He could have forced it, but didn't.
That's just not accurate. I mean, they begged the WBC to order the mandatory. He was number one. People don't understand this, and I've explained this in other venues. If you're the interim champion of a WBC weight class, or even if you're not an interim champion, but you're the number one ranked contender, those are good for your career, obviously, does not make you the mandatory. You don't become the mandatory until the WBC says you are the mandatory, period. And so David Benavidez, for a long time, held interim title, but was not officially the mandatory. Now, the assumption is if a guy's the interim champion or he's number one, at some point they're going to make him the mandatory. In David's case, he had the interim title, and they did make him the mandatory for a while. Finally, they said, yeah, you're the mandatory. But the second part of that never happened, which is send the fucking letter and say you have X number of days to negotiate. We're calling a purse bid. The WBC never actually ordered the fight. That is not David Benavidez's fault. He pressed for it. Samson Lukawitz's promoter pressed for it, and they just did not get any traction there. And so the only other option was to move up to light heavyweight and stop spinning your wheels at super middleweight, where there was not a big fight. And David, I'm not saying he can't make 168, but it wasn't like it was easy to do it. And at some point, you're like, why am I going to continue to chase a ghost, basically? Canelo was clearly not interested in the fight. That's a whole different conversation. And that's his decision. But in the end, you can't force a guy to fight you, period. Now, could the WBC have at least made it uncomfortable for Canelo and forced the issue? Yeah, they could have. But at the end of the day, it is business. And no one usually, unless you're the stupid IBF, is going to force Canelo to make that decision because they want to be in business with Canelo Alvarez. He's good for business. So fair or unfair, that's the reality. The IBF, that's a whole different matter. But in terms of the WBC, they didn't order the fight. They did give Benavidez the opportunity to fight for an interim title in the light heavyweight division, which they said also, if you win, you are the mandatory in the WBC for the winner of the undisputed fight that will take place later in the year. We'll see if they enforce that when it comes time to make the fight for the winner. And I don't know the order of mandatories because the guy who wins between Beterbiev and Bivol is going to have 4 belts, which means 4 mandatories. I just don't know off the top of my head which the order that those will come in. But that's the reason. So the way that the question was worded was not quite accurate because it's not like Benavidez didn't force it. Benavidez is powerless to do it. He's not the one that can force it. It's only the organization that can force it.
We've got about 15 minutes left, so we'll try and get as many as we can. Next question then comes from OQK. It says, jumping in late, however, do you believe Top Rank is setting a collision course for Emiliano Vargas's last fight fought at 140 and Abdullah Mason's last fight fought at 135? Not quite sure that makes sense to me, but does that make sense to you?
I mean, look,
the collision course for the two to fight. Is that what that's saying?
Yeah, I don't think they're on a collision course to fight. I mean, they're at totally different stages of their careers. They're in different weight classes. But that's not to say that years from now, if they both continue to develop, that could not become a thing. Obviously, if you're fighting at 135, usually you're going to be at 140. Who knows how long Vargas is going to stay at 140. I mean, but they are young. That's not like, they're separated by huge amounts of time on the counter. Mason is 20 years old, and I'm not sure how old Vargas is. I want to say maybe he's like 22, something like that. No, but I don't think they're not on a collision course. I mean, if you can envision it down the road a few years, maybe. But right now, it's just they're two good prospects making their way up the ladder, and Top Rank is bringing them along separately. I don't think they're thinking about that at this point.
This question from Simon Stevens, I quite like this one. It says, Dan, after Fury, Usyk, Joshua, etc. retire, who do you think will be the champion at heavyweight? Best wishes from the UK. And what's happened to all the heavyweights in the... he says, and what's happened to all the heavyweights in the States? We talked about that on the show last week, didn't we?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, when Jared Anderson got knocked out, that was pretty much, in terms of up-and-coming heavyweights, kind of the end for the time being, as far as like a guy that was close to being in the championship conversation. In terms of who takes over once those guys have petered out and that sort of, when that era closes, I mean, I guess you're looking at, well, I mean, he's a little older, and because he's now, I want to say he's about 30 now. But Bakhtir Jalolov, who just won his second consecutive super heavyweight gold medal, who's already 14-0 in the professional ranks, even though he went back to compete in the Olympics for the second time that just concluded in Paris. He is with Top Rank. He's a bad boy. He's a big left-handed puncher. So he's a guy that could probably step into that particular void. We haven't seen him yet tested as a professional. Most of his wins are by quick early knockout. But definitely he's a guy that you got to pay attention to. If you win, I mean, by definition, if you're the super heavyweight gold medal winner, you're supposed to become the professional heavyweight champion. Lennox Lewis did it. Anthony Joshua did it. Vladimir Klitschko did it. I mean, there's guys that have failed, but that's the level you're talking about. When you win that, if you go back, years earlier, they weren't necessarily super heavyweights, but like Muhammad Ali, was a gold medalist in the light heavyweight division. Joe Frazier was a gold medalist. George Foreman. I mean, these are the types of fighters that the Olympic gold medals wind up becoming as pros. So by definition, Jalolov is supposed to become a heavyweight professional world champion. So, but besides him, I mean, there's some guys that are on the rise. There's maybe some of the guys that are still doing their thing now that are in the same era, let's say, as Fury and Joshua and Usyk and them. That's like a Joseph Parker who's kind of been reborn in recent fights. If those guys are gone and he's still around, maybe he can step in to the void at least for a period of time and grab another title. But right now, the guys in the heavyweight division that are on the rise, to me anyway, there doesn't seem to be a lot of like can't miss type prospects. The one that I think of, with Jared Anderson, we mentioned in terms of an American, but you got to look in your country, in the UK. Moses Atama has looked awfully good, very young, definitely, somebody to keep an eye on as a real chance to maybe do something. Good puncher, very, very mature. It seems to me. I've watched a lot of his fights. Very poised. Doesn't go crazy when he has a guy hurt. He's very methodical about getting rid of him. So I'd say he's probably the best hope, at least in the UK at the moment, on the way up. And then, we'll see, what's going to come of like the Fabio Wardleys and the Fraser Clarks, who are still in the earlier days in terms of the number of professional fights they have.
Yeah. And I think you said Jaya Pattaya will eventually move up.
Oh, and Jaya Pattaya. Yeah. I meant to say him also. He's a guy that will step up to heavyweight in the not too distant future. He may still have another, couple of fights in the cruiserweight division, but for sure at some point, Jaya Pattaya is going to heavyweight. He said it himself. I mean, that's not a secret. Yeah. Whether he can compete in that division, not being as big as some of these other guys, remains to be seen. I mean, some might say, well, Usyk did it. Well, yeah, but Usyk is a totally different, special kind of guy with the movement and the skills he has. And I'm not knocking Pattaya. He's one of my favorite fighters to watch, but he's not skilled like that.
Yeah. Next one then from Jack McCormack says, does the rumored Conor McGregor versus Manny Pacquiao boxing match from 2021 ever resurface since Pacquiao is still doing boxing exhibitions?
I have no idea, but I just know I watched Manny Pacquiao's most recent exhibition that took place a few weeks ago in Japan, and he should be retired. He got his ass kicked by a kickboxer that's not a boxer. Manny's over 40 years old right now. It was. I covered all of Manny's big fights. I covered it from the day he got to the United States and won the title in a devastating fashion at 122 pounds, all the way through to the end. I was at most of those fights ringside. And Manny Pacquiao is long gone. This guy looks like Manny Pacquiao. He talks like Manny Pacquiao, but he don't fight like Manny Pacquiao. So, and Conor McGregor, he can't even get into the cage to do a MMA fight. So now he's going to do boxing. So, why are we wasting our time with that question?
Fair enough. Right, I've got three more for you. If Crawford refuses any other fight at 154, should Crawford vacate his titles, or will we see a repeat of the 147 where the champions held the titles for years without unifications?
Crawford's in a little bit of a situation here because he's not the one out there saying it, but those around him, Turki Al-Sheikh has certainly said it. I know, obviously, he keeps in touch with Crawford, I guess, because they've been discussing the possibility of this Canelo fight. He just seems stuck on only wanting to fight Canelo, which is his prerogative. I can't argue with that. And that can go on for a little while. But at some point, the organizations are going to come calling. They have mandatories, and you got to make a decision. Am I going to fight? Am I going to defend, or am I going to vacate and hope for a Canelo fight or whatever it may be? look, Crawford, he did just fight a few weeks ago, so there's no hurry there. I'm perfectly happy and willing to allow any fighter to take a couple of months, if not, a little more after they have a fight to sort of assess and digest what's occurred and figure out what their next move is going to be. But Terrence Crawford now has the WBA title at 154. He's got the interim title at one of the WBO in the same weight class. And there's good fights out. There's good fights out there for him. If he can get his mind not just on a Canelo fight, him against Virgil Ortiz is an attractive fight, obviously. Him against Tim Tszyu is an attractive fight. Or, if Murtaza Aliyev wins and makes a name for himself in that win. If Jaron Boots Ennis comes up from welterweight where there's not a lot of stuff going on for him in that weight class. And matter of fact, he's even more kind of in a bind right now because he just got ordered by the IBF to defend the mandatory against freaking Karen Chikadzian, who is an unaccomplished, unknown fighter who he already beat 12 rounds to 0 in an interim title fight, in 2023. So, if Crawford would have a chance to fight him and he would be willing to do it, I mean, Boots would take it in 2 seconds, I'm sure. So anyway, the bottom line is Crawford's got to decide what he wants to do. I, for one, hope that if the Canelo fight doesn't happen, that he'll stay at 154 and defend the titles. There's great fights in that weight class. Sebastian Bandora, he became a mandatory for also because of the fact that he got the interim belt of the WBO. So there's definitely attractive fights for Crawford. It's going to be up to him to talk to Turkey and say, listen, here's what I'd like to pursue. But any of those fights would be worthy fights.
Penultimate question then, Dan. It says, Dan, it happens all the time. Boxers don't make the weight and or blow up 25 pounds on the day of the fight. Frankly, I'm tired of it. Should we go back to same day weigh-ins?
No, I don't believe that's the case. As far as putting on 25 pounds or whatever after the weigh-in, the obligation of the boxer is to make the contracted weight when the commission tells you to stand on the scale. What happens after that? I have no problem. If you go up 5 pounds, you go up 20 pounds, that's life. So if you want to regulate that, either have the weigh-ins later. I don't think day of is I live in the real world. So if you have weigh-ins on the day of the fight, more fights are going to get canceled. Period. That's just unfortunate, but that's just the case. So to mitigate that, still do the weigh-in the day before. Abolish weight restriction clauses. If you can't handle that, fight in a different weight class, period. So go back to the normal time, approximately 24 hours or so, 36 hours before the fight. Stop with look, I was just in LA. I was in the room at 9 o'clock in the morning Pacific time on Friday morning when they did the real weigh-in. Then they did the ceremonial weigh-in at 6 o'clock in the evening. And then they didn't get in the ring until the next day. Obviously it was a long card, so it started in the afternoon. But way more than 24 hours after the fight, or rather after the weigh-in did the fight start. If they would go back to the time where they were doing the real weigh-in, forget the ceremonial bullshit, do the real weigh-in, 3 o'clock or so in the afternoon, 4 o'clock or so in the afternoon, which is typically when those weigh-ins would take place. Do it like that. Now you kind of have where the guy can't put on that much weight, because if you give him from 9 o'clock in the morning, that's an extra bunch of hours. If you're doing it at that time, they're still going to put on weight, fine, but it's not going to be as excessive if you don't give him all that time. And if a guy can't deal with the guy putting on weight because he's made the weight, then fight in a different weight class, period. That's your problem, not his. If you make the contract at the appointed time of the commission, whatever happens, happens.
Right, I've got 2 more for you. One of them I want to end on because it's quite a nice question. We just had this last one come in, and then we're gonna call it a day. It says, "Do you have any update on Teofimo and his next fight, and if the Pueblo versus Martin fight will be on ESPN or Amazon Prime?"
In terms of Teofimo Lopez, there was conversations with Top Rank and his management that they were trying to do a fight where Teofimo would step up to the welterweight division and challenge the now risen from interim to full champion Brian Norman Jr., who was interim but became the full when Terrence Crawford vacated. And so that was an intriguing fight because Teofimo has talked about wanting to move up in weight. Brian Norman may not be the most big name fighter, but he had scored a very good win to get that interim title and is a real good looking young fighter, very young, already got like 26-0 record. Anyway, in the end, Teofimo told his management, you know what, I'm not fighting the rest of the year. I don't know why, he's not injured. He's in the prime time of his career as champion at 140. He can make good money. but certainly that's his choice. So he's not fighting the rest of the year. So that's where we're at with Teofimo. Hopefully he'll be back in whatever he does, whether it's a good defense at 140 or it's a step up to welterweight. In terms of the other thing, in terms of the deal that was made between Alberto Puello and Sandor Martin, Puello had been the interim champion. He was elevated to the full champion when Devin Haney vacated and asked the WBC to make him the champion in recess. And so that had gone where they had ordered a purse bid, but Top Rank and TGB/PBC, they made a deal. And when it does take place, there's no date yet, but it will be promoted by TG Promotions. So it will be on one of the Amazon cards, whether it's one of their non-pay-per-views or pay-per-views is not determined, but it will definitely be an Amazon card.
Excellent. Right. We're going to end the show with one last question.
And by the way, Seb, if they were reading the Substack newsletter, they'd have read that a couple days ago.
Well, that was what I was just about to plug, Dan. I was just going to say, before we end the show, I do want to direct everybody to Dan's Substack. If you check the description of this video, if you check the description of any of the videos that we've done over the past few weeks, there's a link to Dan's Substack in there. If you Google search Fight Freak Substack, Dan Rafael, then you'll find it there. It's well worth subscribing. There's a free element. There's also a paid element. Dan's not asked me to do this, but I get it every day or every other day whenever Dan sends it out, and it really gives me like it sets me up for the day to know what actual boxing content's come. And also, Dan updates the schedule regularly. He adds any fights and takes any fights out whenever they happen. So it's well worth signing up for.
You're hired, Seb. You're hired.
Yeah, even if you just sign up on the free one, it's a really good email. It's really worth doing. And but I'm going to end on this, Dan. I see on your Twitter that you love to post your memorabilia and on this days. So the question comes in from Adrian. It says, Dan, what is your favorite card stroke memorabilia piece in your collection?
That's pretty easy, actually. I have as people who followed me on social media read the newsletter, because in the newsletter, in my notebooks, I always use an anniversary to put up a piece of memorabilia, a picture and a description of what it is and what it's from. But I have a massive collection. I mainly focus on programs and posters, cards, but I have a few other things, obviously. And I've been collecting for a very long time, since like the mid-1980s is when I first probably bought my first boxing poster. But my all-time favorite fighter is Arturo Gatti. And when I covered some of the fights later in his career, his team knew that. And I never asked for this. I'm not the kind, I don't go around asking for autographs. Not really appropriate. I don't ask for that type of thing. But his team sent me a jacket that was used in one of his fights, and that is signed to me from Arturo. And that is my prized possession in my collection. And the other favorite fighter I had is the former 2-division champion, Acelino Popo Freitas. I have one of his fight-worn sweat jackets from his fight week when he won the lightweight title against Zahir Rahim, or defended the title against Zahir Rahim, I guess. And that is also in my collection. So I have a couple of those fight used pieces that are very important to my collection that I look as the centerpieces.
Well, Adrian's just replied and put the signed robe. That's right. So he's obviously been a fan of yours and followed you for a while. So.
It's the jacket. It's not the robe. It's a cool jacket, but it's got the Gatti trademark stuff on it, the blue and the white, and it's got a beautiful autograph, signed to Dan. It's just wonderful.
Brilliant.
And no, you can't have it. You can't have it.
Right. Well, we're going to end the show there. Really appreciate all the questions. If you've enjoyed this, guys watching, let us know in the comments. If you can get us up to 50 likes on this video, we might do another one very soon.
This was fun. Like, we didn't know, like, we were talking about like this, about like, we got a few questions the last time when I did the one with you in LA, and we're like, yeah, maybe we should do like a live Q&A. We had no idea how this is going to work out, but I feel like we got some good stuff today. Yeah,
we have. And I think if we plug it a little bit more, we might get more on the live stream. And that was why I thought it was good to do the review show at the start, so people can see the show and then write comments, which is exactly what we got. So really appreciate all your comments. Really appreciate the feedback that we've had. And me and Dan will be back next Tuesday or next Wednesday, depending on whether we go live or pre-record. Thank you very much for watching. Dan, thanks for joining me. And we will see you next week. Hasta la vista.